Violet Lockhart had spent the better part of 38 years convincing herself that a woman who smelled of flour dust and lye soap before noon had no business entertaining notions of being looked at with anything other than polite indifference. And she had grown so practiced at that particular brand of self-dismissal that it had become as automatic as breathing, as reflexive as pulling her dark hair back into its severe, not every morning before the sun even crested the red mesa east of Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, in the year of our Lord 1883. She was not an ugly woman. She knew that, in the same distant, academic way she knew that the mountains to the north were beautiful. They were beautiful for other people to appreciate. They were there, solid and certain, but they had nothing particular to do with her daily life of kneading bread, tallying supplies, and running the only general store in a town of 400 souls who relied on her steadiness the way they relied on the creek not drying up in August. Dusty Creek was the kind of place that did not invite drama. It had a livery, a hotel that was too grand for its clientele, a saloon that was not grand enough, a church whose minister preached with more passion than accuracy, a schoolhouse with 22 children ranging from 6 to 14, and Lockhart's General Goods, which Violet had inherited from her father 8 years prior when he died of a heart that had simply given up the argument. Her mother had been gone a full decade before that, taken by a fever that swept through the territory like a rumor in spring. So Violet was alone in the particular way that busy people are alone, surrounded by customers and neighbors and the constant bell above her door, but sleeping in the back room of her shop where her father's old cot had been replaced by a narrow iron bed she had ordered from the catalog, the one indulgence she allowed herself, and even that she had justified as a health necessity because her back ached from standing all day. The women of Dusty Creek were kind to her, in the way women are kind to other women they have quietly given up on. They brought her pies at Christmas. They included her in quilting circles. They did not, as a general rule, suggest eligible bachelors anymore, because Violet had deflected enough of those suggestions with such gentle efficiency that it had become understood she was not in the market. Mrs. Caldwell, the preacher's wife, had tried twice in 5 years, and both times Violet had smiled and said something reasonable about being too busy with the store, and Mrs. Caldwell had stopped trying with the good-natured resignation of a woman who knew when a door was firmly shut. Violet told herself she was content, and on most days she nearly believed it. It was a Tuesday in early April when Elijah Yates rode into Dusty Creek, and Violet did not notice him at first, which was itself remarkable, because the bell above her door announced everyone, and she was the kind of woman who catalogued faces the way she catalogued inventory, efficiently and without sentiment. She was behind the counter measuring out dried beans into a cloth sack for old Mr. Prieto when the bell rang, and the door swung open on a gust of warm New Mexico air that smelled of red dirt and something else, something that was weather and leather and a long road, and she said without looking up, "Be with you directly," in the brisk, friendly tone she used for everyone. "No rush, ma'am," said a voice, and that was the first thing she registered, not his face, not his hat, not the width of his shoulders under a coat that had seen serious weather, but his voice, which was low and unhurried and carried the particular quality of a man who was genuinely content to wait rather than merely pretending to be. Mr. Prieto collected his beans and his tobacco and shuffled out with the slow dignity of a man in his 80s, and Violet looked up. He was standing near the far wall, examining the display of work gloves she kept hung on a row of nails, and he was tall, taller than the doorframe had any right to accommodate, with dark brown hair that curled at the ends because it needed cutting, and a jaw that was shaded with several days of trail dust and stubble. He wore range clothes, practical and worn, a long canvas duster open over a dark shirt, wool trousers tucked into boots that were serious about their work. His hat was pushed back on his head in the manner of a man who had been riding into the sun all morning. He turned and caught her looking, and she felt the color move into her face and hated herself for it, and looked back down at her counter with the specific focused attention of a woman organizing objects that did not need organizing. "Morning," he said, moving toward the counter with an easy stride. He pulled off his hat and held it in one hand, and she saw his eyes were the color of good whiskey held up to lantern light, brown and warm and quick. "Good morning," Violet said in her most professional voice. "What can I get for you?" "I need to resupply," he said simply. "Been on the trail 5 days out of Santa Fe. Need flour, coffee, salt pork if you have it, cartridges for a .44 caliber Winchester, and a new pair of those gloves if they run to a large." She nodded, efficient, and began pulling items from their places with the practiced speed of a woman who knew her store the way she knew her own hands. She was acutely conscious of the fact that he did not move away to browse while she gathered his supplies. He stayed at the counter and watched her work with a quiet, direct attention that was not rude but was certainly not the absent stare of a man mentally elsewhere. "You the owner?" he asked. "I am." "Lockhart's," he said. "Sign above the door." "My father's name. Mine too," he nodded. "Elijah Yates," he said, and offered his hand across the counter with a naturalness that surprised her into taking it. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and the handshake was firm without being performative. "Violet Lockhart," she said. "You know," he said, "I have been in a fair number of general stores between here and the Missouri River, and I have never once been helped this quickly or this quietly. Most places a man has to wait while somebody hunts for the salt pork." "The salt pork is there," she said, pointing to the third shelf from the floor on the east wall, "because it needs to stay cooler than the rest, and that wall gets less afternoon sun. The coffee is directly above the flour because they are always bought together. The cartridges are behind me because of the Gallagher boys, who have sticky fingers and bad judgment, and the gloves are by the door because people either remember them on the way in or they need them while their hands are cold." He looked at her for a moment, and then smiled slowly, and it rearranged his face into something warmer and younger. "That is the most sensible store layout I have ever heard explained." She looked at the counter to avoid that smile. "Will that be all?" "One more thing," he said. "I heard in Santa Fe there might be a place in this territory worth settling near." "Heard the grass was good east of the creek and the water was reliable." "It is," Violet said. "The Hennessy land is available, I believe, about 4 miles east. Mr. Hennessy went back to Ohio last fall." "Is that so?" Elijah Yates said, and he did not say it like a man who had already known and was just making conversation. He said it like a man who was genuinely storing away information for later use. He paid for his supplies, which she wrapped and packed with the same quiet efficiency, and he put his hat back on and touched the brim. "Thank you, Miss Lockhart," he said. "Mrs.," she corrected automatically because she always corrected it, and then felt the flash of the old familiar grief, small and manageable by now. "Well, Miss, actually, I apologize." He did not make it awkward. He simply nodded. "Thank you, Miss Lockhart," he said again, and carried his supplies out, and the bell rang over the door, and Violet stood behind her counter for a moment longer than was necessary before she turned to straighten a stack of canned goods that did not need straightening. She did not think about him that evening. She thought about him for the entire evening, which she then spent annoyed at herself for, sitting in her back room with her account books and a cup of tea that went cold, the numbers on the page failing to hold her attention with their usual reliable blankness. He was probably already gone. Cowboys came through Dusty Creek often enough. It was on the route between Santa Fe and several ranches to the east that ran cattle up toward Colorado. Men rode in for supplies and rode out and were never thought of again. She was 38 years old, and she had better sense than to lose 2 hours of bookkeeping over a pair of whiskey-brown eyes and a voice that did not rush. He came back the next morning. She was sweeping the front step when she heard hooves and looked up, and there was Elijah Yates coming down Main Street on a bay horse that moved with the disciplined ease of an animal well trained and well cared for. He pulled up in front of the store and swung down and tied his horse to the post and came up the steps, and she stood holding her broom like a woman caught doing something inexplicable. "Morning," he said, and there was nothing in his tone except genuine goodwill, no edge of presumption, no studied charm. "Good morning," Violet said. "Did you forget something yesterday?" "No," he said. "I went and looked at the Hennessy land. Spent the night out there. It is exactly as described. I am going to speak to whoever handles the property transfer this morning." He paused on the step below her, which put their eyes nearly level. "I thought I would let you know since you told me about it." Violet blinked. "I see. Well, that is very considerate, but you did not need to." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." He smiled again, that rearranging smile. "I also wanted to ask if you might know where I can hire a man or two to help fence and build. I will need help before summer." She told him about the Ramos brothers, who were the best builders in the county and reasonably priced, and about Nate Aldridge at the livery, who generally knew who was looking for work. She told him about the church on Sunday if he wanted to meet people, and about the hotel if he needed a room while his land was being made habitable, and he listened to all of it with his whole attention, the way some people listen to music, as though they are determined not to miss anything. "You are very well informed about this town," he said when she was done. "I run the only general store," she said. "Everyone comes through here eventually." "Then I suspect I will be seeing you often, Miss Lockhart," he said. And he did. He came in every single day. In the first week, it was easy to explain. He needed things for the Hennessy property, which he was already calling the Yates place with the quiet presumption of a man who had made up his mind. He needed lumber nails and window glass and rope, and a good axe and another axe because the first one's handle split, and a new pot because his old one had finally given up its bottom, and seed for a kitchen garden because, as he said perfectly simply, and without any apparent self-consciousness, a man should know how to keep himself fed. Violet provided all of these things and accepted his money and wrote it in her ledger and did not allow herself to watch him walk out the door. She watched him walk out the door. In the second week, the supplies became more occasional and the conversations became something else. He would come in for a spool of thread, or a newspaper if she had a recent one, or tobacco, which he used sparingly, and he would linger at the counter in the unhurried way of a man who was comfortable in a place and comfortable with the person in it. He asked her questions that were not the standard questions people asked shopkeepers. He asked what she had read recently, and when she said she had not had much time to read, he looked genuinely troubled by this, as though it were an injustice requiring remedy. He asked her what she thought of the territorial governor's new land policies, and she gave him her honest opinion, which was pointed and specific, and not at all what most men expected from a woman behind a counter. And instead of doing what most men did, which was to nod in the absent way that meant they had stopped listening, he leaned on the counter and said, "That is a fair point, and I had not considered it from that angle." She was completely undone by this, and retreated into practicality immediately. "Did you need anything else?" she asked. "Not today," he said. "Thank you, Miss Lockhart." He began to look at her directly in a way she found difficult to account for, not with the lazy appreciation men sometimes directed at women they considered briefly interesting before moving along, but with a focused, warm attention that was entirely consistent, entirely genuine, and entirely without the self-awareness that might have made it seem calculated. He looked at her like she was worth looking at. Like looking at her was a reasonable and natural thing to do, as obvious as turning toward the sun on a cold morning. Violet did not know what to do with this. She had been invisible so long that visibility felt like standing in a field during a lightning storm, exposed and uncertain whether what was coming was illumination or disaster. Mrs. Caldwell noticed. Of course Mrs. Caldwell noticed, because Mrs. Caldwell had the social perception of a hawk and the conversational persistence of a woodpecker. And she came into the store one afternoon in the third week of April with a very transparent list of required purchases and a very thinly veiled agenda. "I see that young Mr. Yates has been in again," she said, examining a bolt of calico with more interest than calico warranted. "He is establishing a ranch nearby," Violet said, without emphasis. "He requires supplies. He requires supplies every single day," Mrs. Caldwell observed. "Ranching is demanding work." Mrs. Caldwell set down the calico and looked at Violet with the particular warm directness of a woman who had been watching other people's hearts for 30 years and had learned to read them the way some people read weather. "He is a good-looking man." "I hadn't particularly noticed," Violet said. Mrs. Caldwell smiled the smile of a woman who knew a lie when it was being told with impeccable manners. "Of course not," she said. "How much for 2 yards of this calico?" Violet told her, and Mrs. Caldwell paid and gathered her bundle, and at the door she turned and said, very gently, "You are allowed to notice things, Violet. No one is keeping score." The door closed and the bell settled, and Violet stood behind her counter in the afternoon quiet and did not cry, which required some effort. She was 38. She had been managing a store alone for 8 years. She had gray in her dark hair at the temples that she neither concealed nor mourned. Her hands were practical and capable, and sometimes chapped. She was good at what she did, and she had earned the quiet, solid life she lived through consistent and unglamorous work, and she had made her peace with the fact that the particular kind of happiness that lived in shared mornings and someone's voice saying your name in the dark had not been for her. It was a reasonable peace. She had arrived at it honestly. And then Elijah Yates came in on a Thursday afternoon, not in the morning as was his custom, but in the later light when the dust motes in the air turned gold and the store had the warm amber glow of late afternoon, and he set a jar on her counter. She looked at it. It was a jar of honey, slightly cloudy, the color of amber itself. "I found a hive in the old cottonwood on the east boundary," he said. "The Ramos brothers helped me get it moved to a better place. There was more than I knew what to do with." He pushed the jar a fraction of an inch closer to her across the counter. "I thought you might like some." Violet looked at the jar for a moment, then she looked at him. "You brought me honey," she said. "Yes," he said, simple and unhurried. "Mr. Yates," she said, because she needed to say something sensible, "you do not need to bring me gifts." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." He had said that before. "I know, I wanted to." And each time it had the same quality, not of a line rehearsed, but of a truth so obvious to him that stating it required no more effort than describing the weather. "I will put it to good use," she said, because she had to say something, and he nodded and touched the brim of his hat and left her standing there with a jar of honey and a heart that was doing something it had not done in a very long time, something warm and disorganized and not entirely comfortable, like a room that had been cold and dark for years suddenly having a fire lit in it. All the unseen dust suddenly visible, all the old furniture suddenly casting shadows. She put the honey on the shelf behind the counter where she could see it. She made biscuits that Sunday and used some of the honey, and they were the best biscuits she had made in years, which she acknowledged privately and told no one. The last week of April brought trouble of the ordinary frontier variety, which is to say not catastrophic but certainly disruptive. 2 men came through Dusty Creek, who had the specific look of men between legitimate employment and less legitimate alternatives, and they stopped at Lockhart's General Goods on a Wednesday morning, when Violet was the only person on the premises. They browsed too long and asked prices in a way that was not really about the prices, and one of them leaned on her counter with a casual presumption that she recognized as the beginning of an attempt to intimidate her into something. She was not sure what yet, possibly credit she had no intention of extending, possibly something worse. She had handled worse. She had a shotgun under the counter that had been her father's, and she knew how to use it, and her expression conveyed this without her needing to reach for it. But the situation had a weight to it, the kind of weight that comes from 2 large men who have decided to make themselves comfortable in a small space, and she was measuring her words carefully and keeping her hands visible and relaxed when the bell over the door rang and Elijah Yates walked in. He read the room in approximately 2 seconds. She watched him do it, the brief stillness, the way his eyes moved from her face to the two men to the counter and back, the quality of attention that sharpened without becoming loud or theatrical. He walked directly to the counter, past the two men as though they were furniture, and said to her in a perfectly ordinary tone, "Good morning, Miss Lockhart. I came to ask if that order of fence wire came in on yesterday's wagon." "It did," she said, matching his tone exactly, grateful in a way she could not measure. "I have it in the back. Why don't you come take a look and make sure it is what you specified?" "Thank you," he said, and turned to face the two men with the specific quality of stillness that a man who knows how to handle himself carries in his body naturally, without display but unmistakably. He was not threatening them. He was simply standing there being the size and type of man he was, and meeting their eyes in the direct, unconcerned way of a man who had nothing in particular to prove and nothing in particular to fear. The two men exchanged a look. The one leaning on the counter straightened up. "We were just leaving," the second man said, and they went, with the specific studied casualness of men pretending they had always intended to leave. The bell rang. The door settled. Violet let out a slow breath. "There is no fence wire," she said. "I know," Elijah said. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment with that focused attention. "You had it managed," he said. "I could see that. I just thought it might be easier." "It was," she said quietly. Something shifted between them in that quiet, something that had been accumulating over weeks of daily presence and honest conversation and a jar of honey, something that now had the particular quality of a thing that has been growing underground and has reached the surface, and is no longer something either party can reasonably pretend not to see. "Miss Lockhart," Elijah said. "Violet," she said before she could stop herself, and then looked at her hands on the counter. "Violet," he said, and the way he said it, quiet and direct and warm, the way he said everything, made it sound like something he had been waiting to say for the better part of a month. "I would like to take you to supper at the hotel this Friday evening, if you are willing." She looked up at him. She was very aware of her 38 years and her gray-streaked hair and her rough hands, and she was very aware that none of it seemed to be what he was looking at. He was looking at her, Violet Lockhart, as though she were exactly what he had come looking for, and she had no precedent for what to do with that. "I am 38 years old," she said, which was not what she had intended to say. "I know," he said. "I am 42. Does that trouble you?" It did not. She had not even considered it. "No," she said. "Then will you have supper with me?" She thought of Mrs. Caldwell saying, "You are allowed to notice things, Violet. No one is keeping score." "Yes," she said. "I will." He smiled, and it rearranged his face, and she looked at her hands again and noticed that she was smiling too, in the way she had when she was young and had not yet learned to be careful about it, freely and without management, and she did not try to put it away. The hotel dining room on Friday evening was the finest venue Dusty Creek offered, which was to say it had tablecloths and a menu written on a chalkboard and candles in glass holders that were cleaned often enough to let the light through. Violet wore her blue dress, which she had pressed that afternoon, the one her mother had called her good dress, which was a designation she had maintained through all the years since her mother died because it felt like a form of loyalty. She had unpinned her hair and pinned it up again 3 times before settling on a style that was slightly softer than her usual severe knot, and she had stood looking at herself in the small mirror above her washstand for longer than she was comfortable admitting, not with vanity, but with the slightly vertiginous feeling of a woman who has been alone so long that she has forgotten the proportion of her own face when she is looking at it in relation to something that might actually matter. Elijah was waiting on the hotel steps in a clean shirt and his best coat, and he had gotten a haircut, she noticed, the curling ends trimmed, and the sight of him in the early evening light cleaned up and standing straight, his hat in his hand, watching for her down the street, did something to her chest that she was completely unprepared for. He saw her and his face did the thing with the smile, and he came down the steps to meet her. "You look lovely," he said, simple as everything he said without performance. "You got a haircut," she said, because she needed to say something that was not "I have thought about you every day for a month." "I did," he said. "It was overdue." He offered his arm. She took it. They sat in the dining room, and they ate the hotel's good roast chicken, and Violet drank a glass of wine, and Elijah had one too, and they talked. They talked about where he came from, which was Kentucky originally, the eastern part, where the land was green and folded and very different from New Mexico. And he had come west after the war, not the recent one but the one before, having enlisted at 17 and come out the other side at 21, with a strong preference for open country and a deep reluctance to go back to anything that felt closed in. She listened to him talk about the war with the careful attention she gave to things that carried weight. He did not dramatize it. He spoke of it the way men who had seen real things speak of them, with a slight distance, choosing certain words and leaving others aside. "You were very young," she said. "I was," he said. "I did not know what I was agreeing to. Nobody does at 17. Do you regret it?" He considered this seriously. "I regret the things I saw," he said. "I do not regret that it ended the way it did. That needed to end. Whatever the cost, that needed to end." She looked at him across the candlelight. "Yes," she said, "it did." She told him about her father, about inheriting the store, about the particular challenge of establishing herself as a sole proprietor in a territory where women running businesses were regarded with a mixture of admiration and low-level skepticism. She had spent 8 years navigating. She told him about the Gallagher boys, who were currently 14 and 12, and whose management was now mostly preventive. She told him about the catalog dress she had ordered once that arrived 2 sizes too large, and she had taken in herself and was now quite proud of. He laughed at that genuinely, and she found herself laughing too, and the evening opened up like a good book, each page wanting to be turned. They walked back to her store afterwards slowly, in the warm April night that smelled of the creek and new grass and the particular cleanness of desert air after a spring rain. They walked close but not touching. The stars over New Mexico territory were absolutely outrageous. She had never lost her appreciation for them, and she stopped once to look up. "When I was a girl," she said, "my father used to say the stars out here were so bright because the sky was practicing." Elijah stopped beside her and looked up. Practicing for what? He never said. He liked the idea that it was still figuring something out. Elijah looked at the stars for a long moment. "I like that," he said. They stopped at her door. The store was dark, the closed sign in the window. She turned to face him. "Thank you," she said. "That was a very good evening." "It was," he agreed. He held her gaze in the way he did, steady and warm and without a single angle to it. "Would you like to have supper again sometime?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation this time. He smiled. He put his hat on. He said good night and walked back down the street, and she stood at her door watching him go. And she went inside and did not sleep well because her mind was too warm and too occupied, and she found she did not particularly mind. May arrived and the ranch took shape. She could see the progress whenever Tom Prieto, Mr. Prieto's son, drove supplies out that way and reported back, because Dusty Creek was a town where information was a form of currency, and everything was eventually reported back to the general store. The Ramos brothers had framed a proper house, not the original Hennessy structure which was falling, but a new one, 2 rooms with a good roof and a covered porch that faced west to catch the evening light. Elijah had planted the kitchen garden and fenced the near pasture and bought a small herd, 12 head of good breeding cattle from a rancher to the south. He came in every morning still, without fail, sometimes for supplies, sometimes to ask a question about local knowledge she almost always had, sometimes simply to lean on the counter for 15 minutes and talk, the way she had seen men do in the saloon, except he chose her counter, and he chose to talk about things worth talking about. And he chose to listen when she spoke in a way that made her feel that her words were not simply tolerated but genuinely received. "You are very good at this," she said one morning, without planning to. He looked up from examining a new shipment of agricultural almanacs she had just set on the counter. "At what?" "Listening," she said. He thought about this. "I was not good at it when I was young," he said honestly. "I was in too much of a hurry to say the next thing. It took me a while to understand that the most interesting thing in any room is usually what the other person knows that you do not." She looked at him for a moment. "That is a very good thing to have figured out," she said. "I am a slow study," he said, with the self-aware humor that she had come to recognize as one of his most consistent qualities. "But I get there eventually." They had supper at the hotel again the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and by the third Friday Mrs. Caldwell had apparently spread word in the gentle, enthusiastic way that was her particular gift, and Violet was receiving knowing smiles from multiple directions, which she accepted with her best impassivity, while privately discovering that she did not actually mind as much as she had expected. The Saturdays became something different. Elijah had a habit of finishing his week's work by midday Saturday, and on the second Saturday in May, he appeared at the store at noon and asked if she might like to ride out and see the progress on the house. She closed early, which she had not done on a Saturday since her father's funeral. She saddled her own horse, the brown mare she kept at Aldridge's livery, and they rode out east of the creek in the warm May sunshine, and she saw the Yates place for the first time. It was good land. She understood land in the practical way of someone who had lived in a territory long enough to know what good land looked like in terms of grass quality and water proximity, and the angle of the sun across the fields in the growing season. The house was neat and solid, the new wood bright and raw in the sunlight, the porch post straight. The kitchen garden was in rows that were carefully laid, more carefully than most men would bother with, and she recognized in this the same organizational mind she had observed in his preference for a store where the salt pork was on the cooler wall. He showed her around with a quiet pride that was not boastful but was genuinely felt, the pride of a man who has built something with his hands that is exactly what he intended it to be. "The south room will be the main living area," he said. "And the north room is for sleeping for now. I can add on when the time comes." She noticed the "for now" and the "when the time comes," and she did not remark on them, but they settled into her with the quality of seeds landing in good soil. "It is a fine place, Mr. Yates," she said. "Elijah," he said. "Elijah," she said. They sat on the porch for a while in the afternoon, and he made coffee on his camp stove, which was still his primary cooking apparatus, while he waited for the range he had ordered to arrive from Santa Fe. And they drank the coffee and watched the cattle move in the far pasture, and the hawks circle over the mesa and the light change on the mountain. "I have been happy here," he said, with a simplicity that would have been startling except that everything he said was simple. "Happier than I have been in a long time." Violet held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the mountain. "I am glad," she said. "You are part of that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountain too, and there was a deliberateness to that, as though he was giving her space to hear it without the added weight of his eyes on her face. "Elijah," she said carefully. "I know I am going about this in a particular way," he said. "Slowly, coming in every day and talking about almanacs and fence wire and territorial politics." He turned and looked at her then. "But I wanted you to know me, not a version of me that was trying to be impressive. I wanted you to know the actual man and decide from that whether this was worth your time." Violet set her coffee cup down on the porch rail with great care. "Do you know," she said, "that I have been telling myself for years that I was finished with wanting certain things." "What things?" he asked gently. "Company," she said. "The permanent kind." She looked at her hands. "I had convinced myself very thoroughly. And now," she looked up at him, "you are making it very difficult to stay convinced," she said. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with that steady whiskey-brown attention, and he said, "Good." He kissed her on the porch of his half-finished ranch house in the warm May afternoon, slowly and without any urgency, in the way of a man who had decided something and was entirely at peace with his decision. And she kissed him back in the way of a woman who had forgotten how and then remembered that the body does not actually forget. And the hawks went on circling, and the cattle went on moving in the far pasture, and the mountain went on being enormous and indifferent, and none of it mattered at all. She rode home in the evening light with a different quality of silence in her than she had ridden out with, full rather than empty, warm rather than the specific cool that loneliness maintains even in warm weather. She was 38 years old and she was not finished. She had not known that with any certainty until now. June brought the summer heat and several things at once. The range arrived for Elijah's kitchen, and he cooked her a meal on it the Sunday after it was installed, which was an event she approached with mild skepticism and departed from with genuine appreciation, because the man could cook, simply and without pretension, good solid food that was exactly what it was meant to be. They ate on his new porch in the evening cool, and she brought a pie she had made, the first pie she had made with the express intention of sharing it with a specific person in a very long time, peach from the preserved peaches she kept in the store, and they sat and ate pie and watched the moon come up over the mesa. "My mother used to say," Violet said, watching the moon, "that a woman who can make a good pie will always have company." "She was right," Elijah said, "though I suspect you would have company regardless. You are flattering me." "No," he said in the direct way he said things. "I am accurate." She looked at him sideways. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that was both entirely open and enormously serious, the look of a man who is about to say something he has considered carefully. "Violet," he said. "Yes," she said, which was technically not an answer to a question but which felt like one. "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not right now. Not this moment. I want you to be certain. I want there to be no question in your mind that you know who I am and what you would be agreeing to. But I want you to know that is where I am going, so you can tell me now if it is not where you want to go." The moon was very large and very white above the mesa, and the night smelled of sage and warm earth and whatever wood he had used to build his porch. And Violet Lockhart sat with a piece of peach pie on her knee and felt 38 years rearrange themselves around this moment with a kind of stunned tenderness. "Elijah," she said, "I have been alone for a long time." "I know." "Not unhappily," she said carefully, because honesty mattered. "I want to be clear about that. I was not miserable. I had a life I built and I was proud of it." "I know that too," he said. "That is one of the things I admire most." "But," she said, she stopped. "But," he said gently. "But I think I would like," she said slowly, finding each word with great care, "to not be alone in the way I have been." "Then we agree," he said, and did not push further, and finished his pie, and they sat with the moon and the sage smell and the perfect warm silence that belongs to two people who have said everything necessary, and have run out of the need to fill the air with more words. July brought an event that put Dusty Creek into a state of heightened attention for 2 weeks. The land office received a challenge to the Hennessy title, which meant that Elijah's claim on the Yates place was temporarily in legal uncertainty, because a man in Santa Fe named Burwell claimed he had bought the land from Hennessy before Hennessy left for Ohio. This was potentially serious. Land claims in New Mexico Territory in 1883 were not always straightforward, particularly with the territory's complicated legal history involving Mexican land grants and subsequent American territorial law, and a certain amount of deliberate confusion sown by speculators who had discovered that ambiguity was profitable. Elijah took the news with the same unruffled quality he brought to everything, which Violet had come to understand was not indifference, but was a deep, earned capacity for patience in the face of things that could not be rushed. He rode to Santa Fe with his papers and spent a week there, and Violet found the week considerably longer than its 7 days, which she acknowledged privately as evidence that she had become thoroughly accustomed to a presence she had not had 7 weeks prior. He sent a letter from Santa Fe, which arrived on a Thursday via the mail wagon. It was 2 pages in his careful handwriting, which she had seen before on supply lists, and it was primarily a factual account of his progress with the land office but contained, at the bottom of the second page, written in a slightly different pressure as though added after the main letter was complete, the following sentence: "I find that Santa Fe is considerably less interesting than Dusty Creek, and I believe we both know why." She read that sentence 4 times, and then folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, and went back to stocking shelves with the specific focused energy of a woman, directing her attention very firmly at what her hands were doing. He came back on a Saturday with a decision in his favor. The Burwell claim had lacked proper documentation, and the Hennessy sale had been recorded before any alleged prior sale, and the land was his without question. He rode in at midday while she was in the middle of a busy Saturday rush, and she saw him tie his horse through the window and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized had been pulled tight. He came in and waited at the counter while she finished serving the Morrison family, who were buying provisions for a long trip north, and when they finally filed out, he came to the counter and said, "It is mine. The land is clear." "I know," she said. "I had confidence in it." He looked at her. "Did you miss me?" "Yes," she said, because he asked things directly and deserved direct answers. "Good," he said again, with that particular satisfied directness that she had stopped finding startling and had begun to find simply characteristic. "I have to get back to the ranch and check on what the Ramos brothers have been doing in my absence, but I want to take you to supper this evening, and I want to ask you something at supper." She knew what the question was going to be. She had known since the evening on the porch with the pie and the moon. She had spent the week of his absence quietly accounting to herself for the state of her own heart, and finding that, when she did so honestly, and without the overlay of protective skepticism she had worn so long, the answer was very clear. She was 38 years old, and she was in love with a man named Elijah Yates who came to her store every single day and listened to her with his whole attention, and had once brought her honey from a wild hive, and had kissed her on his porch in May, and was now looking at her across her counter with an open, serious, warm expression that was the most uncomplicated thing she had seen in years. "I will be ready at 7, she said. He smiled and touched his hat and left, and she served 3 more customers, and accepted a delivery of dry goods from the afternoon wagon and swept her front step, and went into the back room and sat on her bed for 5 minutes with her hands in her lap, not doing anything, just feeling the very specific quality of a moment that is about to change everything, holding it as long as it would allow. She wore the blue dress again. She pinned her hair differently, lower, with a few loose pieces at her temples that she had seen in a magazine illustration, and had practiced once in the mirror and immediately unpinned, and now, on impulse, tried again. She looked at herself in the small mirror and thought, "There you are," as though a version of herself had been standing slightly behind her own reflection for years and had just stepped forward. Supper was the hotel dining room again, and it had the same candlelight and the same tablecloths and the same chalkboard menu, but the quality of the evening was different in the way that evenings are different when they are carrying something. They ate. They talked. He told her about Santa Fe and the land office, and a judge he had met who had opinions about everything and the energy to share all of them. She told him about the Morrison family's trip and the new catalog that had arrived with a section on farming equipment that she thought he should look at when he had a moment. They were easy together in the way they had become over 3 months of daily presence and honesty, and underneath the ease was the current of the thing that was coming. He waited until after the coffee was poured. "Violet," he said. "Yes," she said again, in that same way. "I told you I was going to ask you," he said. "You did." "I am asking," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them. It was a ring, a simple band of gold with a small oval setting, a garnet dark red, the color of good claret. "I had this from my grandmother," he said. "She wore it her whole life and was happy, which seemed like a good omen." Violet looked at the ring. She looked at him. "I love you," Elijah said, with the same simplicity he brought to everything, the same honest directness. No flourish, no performance, just the fact of it laid down like something he was putting on the table between them alongside the ring. I have loved you since that first morning when you explained why the salt pork was on the east wall, and I understood that I was talking to someone I would not get to the end of in a long time. Maybe ever. He paused. Will you marry me? Violet Lockhart looked at the garnet ring and the candle and the man who had come into her store on a Tuesday in April and had not stopped coming, who had come every single day without exception, who had looked at her with the whole steadiness of his attention when she had been certain that no one would look twice. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He picked up the ring and slid it onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which she acknowledged later was probably coincidence but felt at the time like something else, something more deliberate. His hand over hers on the table was large and warm and entirely certain. The minister who married them on the last Saturday of August had more passion than accuracy, as was his custom, but he had genuine warmth for the people of his congregation, and it showed in the way he spoke the words over them, as though he believed them sincerely, which she supposed was the most important qualification for the work. The church was full. Dusty Creek had opinions about its own members and their milestones, and Violet Lockhart marrying the man who had moved to the Yates place was considered to be among the more satisfying developments in recent memory. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front pew with an expression of absolute vindication that she was wearing with charitable restraint. Violet wore a dress she had made herself from a bolt of cream-colored muslin she had kept in the store for 2 years without selling, because every time someone reached for it, she had quietly discouraged the color as impractical and then felt guilty about it afterward. She understood now that she had been keeping it without knowing she was keeping it. The bodice had small fabric buttons, and the skirt had enough fullness to move well, and she had embroidered tiny blue flowers at the collar, because she had the steady hands for it, and it seemed like the right thing to do with a moment this significant. Elijah stood at the front of the church in the same good coat he had worn to supper, with his boots polished and his hat in his hands, and when she walked in from the back, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly and warmly, and without any management, as though what he felt was not something he thought required concealing or modulating, and she walked toward him feeling 38 years old and exactly right and entirely herself, which was all she had ever actually wanted. The reception was in the church hall, organized by Mrs. Caldwell and several others with the creative energy that good-natured community meddling produces when it has finally been given a legitimate outlet. There was a great deal of food and 2 fiddlers and a table of pies, including a peach pie that Violet had made herself, and that was consumed with notable speed. She danced twice with her husband, a word she tested in her mind on the dance floor, and found that it did not feel strange or heavy but simply warm, like a coat that fits. Elijah danced with more willingness than skill, and she did not mind this at all, and they laughed together twice on the floor, once at a misstep on his part and once at a misstep on hers, and she thought, this is what it is. This is the actual thing. Not the ceremony but this, the laughter on the dance floor, the easy forgiveness of a misstep, the hand at her back and the way it stayed. She kept the store. This was never a question. Elijah had not married a woman with a business, with any intention of asking her to abandon it. He helped on Saturdays and on slow weekday mornings when he could leave the ranch for a few hours, taking the heavy deliveries and reorganizing the back storeroom with the same methodical attention he brought to fencing, and they developed a rhythm together that fit their separate strengths the way good things fit. She rode out to the Yates place on Sunday afternoons, often with a basket of something she had made, and they spent those afternoons in the way she had observed happy married people spend their private time, in a combination of shared work and shared rest, and the particular conversation of people who are genuinely interested in each other's thoughts, which does not diminish with familiarity but deepens, because the more you know a person, the more specific and interesting the conversations become. The Ramos brothers had added a second room to the north side of the house by September, at Elijah's request and with Violet's approval, and the room had a good window facing east to catch the morning light. She did not ask him why he had specified the morning light. She understood it when she slept in that room for the first time in October and woke to the sun coming through the glass and laying a warm rectangle across the floor, and Elijah beside her, sleeping with the uncomplicated depth of a man who works hard and sleeps clean, and she thought, I am home. She was 38, and this was the first morning of many, and she was home. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was not particularly severe by New Mexico Territory standards, which still meant several weeks of cold that required serious firewood and the kind of preparation that the territory demanded of anyone who lived in it honestly. Elijah had cut and stacked enough wood in October to withstand a longer winter than they got, which was characteristic, and she learned that autumn that his approach to provision was the same as hers, specific and forward-thinking, and grounded in a pragmatic refusal to be caught unprepared. She moved her necessities to the ranch that December. The store remained open, of course, and she remained its keeper, but the narrow iron bed in the back room was now a supply surface, and her life had its center 4 miles east of Dusty Creek on land that smelled of sage and cattle, and the cottonwood tree by the east boundary, where a repurposed honeybee hive produced honey that Elijah kept her well supplied with, which she had stopped finding symbolic and had simply accepted as one of the consistent pleasures of her new life. They had their first real argument in January about the account books. Elijah had a farmer's instinct to minimize debt and to spend only what was certain, which she respected completely. But he had expressed a mild concern about the store's credit extended to 3 families she knew were in temporary difficulty, and she had explained her reasons with a patience she was proud of, and he had not entirely conceded the point, and they had spent an evening on opposite sides of the parlor fire being politely cool to each other, which was deeply uncomfortable. He came to her after an hour with 2 cups of coffee and said, I believe you know your customers better than I do. You are right that cash flow requires management, she said. They drank the coffee. The fire crackled. I will trust your judgment on the accounts, he said. It is your business and you know it. I will be more explicit with you about the reasoning when I extend credit, she said, so you are not working from incomplete information. He looked at her with a quality of attention that was more focused than usual. That is fair, he said. Arguments should end with both people having more information than they started with, she said. Otherwise, what was the point? He looked at her for another moment and then made a sound that was close to a laugh, warm and genuine. You are extraordinary, he said. I am practical, she said. Those are not mutually exclusive, he said. She drank her coffee and felt the warmth of the fire and his arm along the back of the settee, and thought that disagreements resolved this way were entirely manageable, better than no disagreements at all, which would mean they were not actually talking to each other. February brought the news she had been holding quietly in her own body for several weeks, which she had arrived at with an initial period of stunned arithmetic and a subsequent period of sitting very still in the morning light of the east-facing room, and taking stock of what she felt, which was, beneath the disbelief, something that could only be described as joy. She was 39 in February. She had not imagined this was possible with any seriousness. She had set it aside with the other things she had set aside, a long time ago, as belonging to a life that was being lived by someone else. She told Elijah on a Sunday evening after supper, in the plain way she told him most things, directly and without elaborate setup, because she had learned that directness was what worked between them. I am going to have a child, she said. He was quiet for a long moment, and she held her breath in a way she had not held it since he asked her to marry him, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was too big for his face to fully contain, something that was past surprise and into a territory that did not have a clean name. Are you certain? He said quietly. Quite certain, she said. He put his arms around her in the careful way of a man who is being very deliberate about the amount of force he uses, and she felt him exhale against her hair, a long, slow exhale that carried something of the same character as the moment on the dance floor when they had both laughed at a misstep, the sound of a man who has more feeling than he has words for. "We are going to need another room," he said, into her hair. She laughed. She could not help it. And she felt him smiling against her hair, and it was one of the best moments of her life, standing in the kitchen of the house he had built on the land he had claimed, 39 years old, and expecting a child, and being held by a man who had walked into her store on a Tuesday and had never once looked away. Dr. Hatch was the only physician in the county, a spare, efficient man of 55 who had seen everything the territory could produce, and who managed Violet's situation with a competence and matter-of-factness she appreciated. He told her that 39 was not excessive, that he had attended women in their early 40s, and that she was in good health and good physical condition from years of active work, and that he would check on her monthly. She was sick in the mornings for the first 2 months with the cheerless efficiency of a body doing what it needed to do, and she managed the store from the counter with a slightly different pallor than usual and a cup of ginger tea that the Ramos brothers' mother had recommended, and which actually helped, and she mentioned none of it to her customers, who found out anyway because this was Dusty Creek and information was a form of currency, and everything got back to the general store eventually. Mrs. Caldwell brought her a small knitted blanket in March, yellow and soft, and set it on the counter without preamble and said, "I started this the day I heard." And Violet held it for a moment and said, "Thank you, Abigail," which was the first time she had used the woman's Christian name, and Mrs. Caldwell blinked 3 times quickly and then said in a brisk voice that she was going to need a yard of the blue calico. Elijah was, in the specific way of men who are not sure what they are allowed to do, quietly and thoroughly attentive. He came to the store every morning still, but now he made a point of taking the heavy deliveries without being asked, and occasionally sitting behind the counter in a posture of helpful proximity that was touching in its transparency. He could not do much, but he was determined to do whatever he could, which she found she loved about him in a deep and specific way that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with the actual texture of a shared life. The third room was built by the Ramos brothers in June, off the back of the house, with a window on the south wall in good solid construction, as everything the Ramos brothers built was, and Elijah painted the walls himself in a warm white that caught the light well, and between them they assembled a cradle that had been ordered from the Santa Fe catalog, a good solid piece of work with curved rockers, and she placed it under the south window and stood looking at it for a long time on a warm June evening. With Elijah beside her, both of them quiet in the way of people regarding a thing that is both very concrete and enormously large in its implications. "Are you frightened?" Elijah asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Thoroughly," he said. "Good," she said. "That seems right." He took her hand and they stood looking at the cradle, and the summer evening came through the south window warm and full of the smell of sage and the cattle moving in the far pasture, and she thought, "We are going to do this. We are going to be very good at this, not because we know what we are doing, but because we will not stop paying attention." The child was born in August, on a morning that smelled of the coming of the year's first real rain, which arrived at noon, and which she later told Elijah she considered an excellent omen, a thorough cleansing of the world in honor of the occasion. Dr. Hatch was there, and Mrs. Caldwell, who had appointed herself to this role, and whom Violet was entirely grateful for, and Elijah, who had stationed himself in the front parlor with the specific contained anxiety of a man who wants very badly to be useful, and has been told in no uncertain terms that the most useful thing he can do is remain in the front parlor. The child was a boy. Elijah held his son for the first time with the careful intensity of a man holding something he is afraid of dropping, not from weakness, but from an excessive care that showed in every deliberate angle of his arms. And the boy, who was pink and loud and had a surprising amount of dark hair, immediately curled one fist around Elijah's finger with the total commitment of an entity that has just arrived in the world and intends to establish its position immediately. Elijah looked at Violet across the room with an expression she had no words for and no need of words for, and she looked back from the bed where she was exhausted and warm and entirely satisfied with the state of the world. And the rain came down outside, and the new room smelled of fresh wood and the particular clean smell of a new person. And the boy cried at the rain and then stopped, just like that, as though he had considered it and decided it was not actually alarming. They named him Thomas James Yates, Thomas for her father and James for Elijah's brother, who had died in the war and whose name Elijah carried quietly in the way men carry certain things, not displayed but not forgotten. Tommy from the first week, which was the name he became and kept. The store continued. Life continued. She went back to work 6 weeks after Tommy was born, having arranged a careful system with the Ramos brothers' youngest sister, a capable girl of 17 named Alina, who came to the ranch on the days Violet was at the store, and who Tommy apparently regarded as deeply satisfactory company based on the amount of noise he failed to make in her presence. Violet was 40 when Tommy took his first steps, on the porch of the Yates ranch, on a spring afternoon when Elijah was watching from the bottom step, and she was at the door, and the boy let go of the porch post he had been using as an anchor and took 3 very deliberate steps toward his father with the total concentration of a person who has decided to do something and is doing it. And then sat down abruptly on the porch boards and looked at both of his parents with an expression of profound self-satisfaction. Elijah caught her eye and grinned, the full, unmanaged version of the rearranging smile, and she felt it in her chest the same way she had felt it in April of 1883 when she had been behind her counter and had looked up and had not yet understood what was beginning. She was 40 and she was watching her son take his first steps toward his father on a spring afternoon on a ranch in New Mexico territory, and she was happy, specifically and completely, and without reservation, in the way that happiness arrives when you have stopped performing it and started simply living it. Dusty Creek grew, in the slow, incremental way of territorial towns that are on the right side of a road that is being traveled more often. A second general store opened in 1886, which Violet regarded with the calm professional confidence of a woman who had been in her location for 8 years before any competition appeared, and who had relationships with her customers that a new establishment would require significant time to match. She was right. The second store did reasonable business with the newer families and with travelers, but the residents of Dusty Creek were loyal in the way of people who have been served well through hard years, and Lockhart's General Goods remained what it had always been, the reliable center of the town's practical life. Elijah's ranch expanded in 1885, when he bought the adjacent parcel from a man named Garrett who had decided that cattle ranching was less congenial than he had anticipated and wanted to go back to Missouri. It gave them better water access and a full extra section of grass, and Elijah hired 2 permanent hands, young men named Cobb and Rivera, who were reliable workers and who became something like fixtures, eating at the ranch house on Sundays with the easy familiarity of men who know they are valued. Tommy was 3 when his sister arrived, another August child, this one quieter than her brother in arrival and noisier than him in the weeks that followed. A girl with Elijah's coloring and Violet's precise, observant eyes who was named Clara Margaret. Clara for Violet's mother and Margaret because Elijah said it was a name that sounded like someone who would know her own mind, which proved accurate. Violet was 41 when Clara was born, and she felt good, better than she had expected, strong in the specific way of a woman who has learned to take care of herself because she has people who need her too, and doctor. Hatch said she was a remarkable patient, which she accepted as a professional assessment and not as flattery. The family had a life that was full in the way of frontier families, practically demanding and logistically complex and genuinely rewarding, the way things are rewarding when they are built by actual labor rather than received ready-made. Elijah rode out at dawn and came in at dusk covered in the honest dirt of the work. Violet opened the store at 7 and closed it at 6 and made supper on the evenings she was at the ranch. And on the evenings she was not, Alina kept things ordered in the way she was increasingly good at, and Tommy helped his father, and Clara demanded explanations for everything she encountered, which was an amount of everything that kept her parents in a state of constant, engaged attention. On an evening in October of 1887, after supper with the children in bed and the lamps lit against the early dark of autumn, Elijah sat at the kitchen table and watched her wash the dishes and said, in the conversational way he had always had without preamble or scene setting, "I want to tell you something." She dried her hands and turned and looked at him. "When I rode into Dusty Creek," he said, "I was not, strictly speaking, looking for anything." "No," she said. "No," he said. "I was looking for good land, which I found. I was not looking for a person." He paused, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "And then you told me where the salt pork was." She laughed and he smiled, and the lamp made his face warm and familiar, the face she had been looking at for more than 4 years now, the face she knew in every variety of light and mood and expression, and it was still the most interesting face in any room she was in. "I came back the next day," he said, "because I could not think of a good reason not to." "You needed supplies," she said. "I needed to talk to you again," he said. "The supplies were a convenience." She came and sat across from him at the table, and he looked at her across the lamp with the steady whiskey-brown attention that had not changed in 4 years, that she no longer found disorienting because she had learned to look back at it with her own steady regard, having practiced the particular art of being seen and not flinching. "I am glad you came back," she said. "I came back every day," he said. "You did," she said. "I intend to keep doing that," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. His hand turned and held hers in the automatic way of something deeply habitual, and they sat in the lamplit kitchen of the house he had built on the land he had worked, with their children sleeping in the back rooms and the October wind beginning its conversation with the cottonwood tree at the east boundary, and there was nothing unresolved between them, nothing she wished were different, no strand of her life she would pull to make the pattern come out differently. She had been 38 and certain. She had been so practiced at the certainty that it had felt like bedrock. And then a man had walked in from the red dirt April road, had held a pair of work gloves and turned and looked at her, and had come back every single day until she understood that the bedrock had not been certainty at all but simply habit, and beneath the habit was everything she had stopped believing in, which had been waiting with the patient indifference of water underground, present the whole time, requiring only that something reach deep enough. Elijah had reached. Not with drama or argument or any elaborate campaign, but simply by showing up, day after day, with his honest attention and his quiet steadiness, and a jar of honey from a wild hive, until the ground between them was so well-traveled that it felt like home, because it was. The years moved through the New Mexico territory the way years do, with their mix of drought and good rain and the slow establishment of a place as a place, the accumulation of shared seasons into something solid. Tommy grew into a boy who was his father's shadow in the fields and his mother's echo in his tendency to notice where things were most efficiently placed, a combination that produced a child of 11 who could reorganize the feed shed in half the time of either adult, and who had strong opinions about the logic of everything. Clara was 8 and had been reading since she was 5, and had recently made clear to everyone who would listen that she intended to study medicine, a statement that Dr. Hatch received with unfeigned pleasure, and Elijah received with a prompt offer to ride her to the doctor's office whenever she wanted to learn something, and Violet received with the internal recognition of a woman who sees her own determination looking back at her from a small face. They were, all 4 of them, exactly who they were going to be. Not finished, never finished, but legible, readable as people, the way people become legible when they are allowed to be themselves without apology. Violet stood on the porch of the Yates Ranch on a morning in April of 1892, 9 years after a Tuesday when a tall cowboy had walked into her store and held a pair of work gloves and turned and said good morning. And she was 47, and her hair was more silver than dark now, and her hands were still capable, and her eyes were still precise. And she watched the sun come up over the mesa in the specific way it came up in New Mexico, not gradually but decisively, as though it had made up its mind. Elijah came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her and handed her one, and she took it, and they watched the sun together in the comfortable silence that is the inheritance of people who have been talking honestly to each other for 9 years and no longer need to fill every moment with words. In the far pasture, the cattle were moving. In the room off the back of the house, Clara was probably already awake and reading, as she was every morning by 6. Tommy was likely in the barn, having developed his father's habit of early rising and productive mornings. Alina, who now managed the store 2 days a week with the competence of someone who had grown into a very capable woman, would be opening the shutters on Main Street. Everything was accounted for. Every thread of the life they had made together ran to its conclusion and held. 9 years tomorrow, Elijah said, meaning the day he had ridden into Dusty Creek. 9 years, she said. Are you glad? He said, which was the same simple, direct question he had always asked, requiring the same simple, direct answer. Every day, she said. Are you? Every single day, he said. She leaned against his shoulder in the April morning, and he put his arm around her with the completeness of 9 years of practice, and they watched the sun finish rising over the mesa. And the new light fell across the land they had built together, and the house they had built together, and the life they had built together from the raw material of 2 people who had both, by different roads, arrived at the same April morning ready for exactly this, even if only one of them had known it. The honeybee hive in the old cottonwood at the east boundary was still there, still producing, still filling jars that Violet kept behind her counter and used in her biscuits and gave away at Christmas. And the sweet weight of the honey was the same as it had always been, exactly as much as it needed to be, nothing wasted, nothing held back, the whole of it given freely in the warm and unhurried way of things that were made to be shared. She had been certain no cowboy would look twice. One had looked and had not stopped looking, and she had looked back, and that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, it was everything. It was the best and most complete thing she had ever had, and it was hers for as long as the sun came up over the mesa and the sage smelled of itself in the morning air, and the man beside her reached for her hand with the same naturalness he had always had, as though reaching for her was not a choice but a direction, the way the sun moves, the way water finds its level, the way things that belong together eventually arrive at the same place and stay.